Welcome to the Blevins Franks insight and update on the latest round of Brexit negotiation talks. My name is Ben Simmons, and in a moment I will be introducing you to my colleague Jason Porter. Firstly though, I did just want to acknowledge that although there have been an easing in the restrictions following the outbreak of the coronavirus, we are all still working remotely at the moment. Hence you will see that these videos are recorded from our homes rather than our usual office environment. At Blevins Franks, we have been advising UK nationals moving to live in Europe for over 45 years. Now, more than ever, it's important to get the appropriate advice to make sure that that transition to your new home is as smooth as possible. Today, Jason will be looking at the key issues raised in the talks and how this could impact your move this year and in the years ahead. This includes the current status of the negotiations, the key dates involved, what it looks like moving before the end of the transition period, and what a no-deal Brexit could mean for you.
Thank you, Ben, for the introduction, and welcome everybody to what we hope will provide you with a Brexit recap and update. The past 3 months have seen headlines, newspaper articles and television debate shows dominated by the coronavirus. If you were in the course of moving to the EU, then obviously your plans have been curtailed and you're very eager to find out what the situation currently is and where you might be in the future. In addition, some of you would have been looking to move after 31st December 2020 when the UK fully leaves the EU. So you'll be interested in whatever system may well be introduced after this date. As the rules start to loosen and we're starting to see estate agents' doors opening again, and we're starting to see European countries looking to the UK to negotiate air bridge agreements, then obviously it could be a time when you can start travelling again. So what we need to do now is review where we are, but also review the fundamental starting points of each of the negotiating teams from the UK and the EU. Okay, let's look at the starting point of each side in these negotiations to see where the differences are and perhaps understand why little progress has been made so far and understand why overall we may well have an issue coming up to the deadline of 31st December. The UK would like a basic free trade agreement for both goods and services, but also a series of separate agreements, satellite agreements covering things like fisheries, things like data protection, financial services and policing. The EU, on the other hand, is looking for a comprehensive, all-encompassing agreement that covers all aspects of the future relationship with the UK, but where the UK isn't allowed to cherry-pick the best bits of being in the EU without making a financial contribution to the EU as a whole. You may well have heard the term level playing field used an awful lot. This is something that the EU sees as being very important, where there are various rules and regulations in the EU around state subsidies, around certain sponsorship of companies, around tax reliefs, all those sort of things. And the EU is concerned that the UK might use this as an opportunity to subsidise certain companies which would allow them to place goods and services in the EU at prices underneath what European countries may be able to produce them at. So there is that concern. The UK, on the other hand, doesn't see this as an issue. It's determined to have its own policies with little regulatory alignment with the EU, perhaps akin to what occurs in terms of the Canada and Japan trade deals that are there at the moment. Now, in terms of governance of any future agreement that might be there, this is where there's a real fundamental difference of opinion. The EU is determined to have the European Court of Justice as the overall arbiter of any disputes between EU nations and between the UK and the EU itself. The UK rejects the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, and this is a real stumbling point for both sides. We've all heard about fishing. Well, perhaps it's important to understand the size of the fishing industry in the UK. It makes up 0.12% of UK GDP, contributing £1.4 billion per year. Financial services, on the other hand, make up 6.9% of UK GDP and £119 billion contribution to that. In terms of employment, UK fisheries employs 24,000 people. But the reason why it is so important is because 52% of those people are in Scotland, and there is a significant local exposure to some of these industries in coastal towns. We've also seen pictures on the TV from the cod wars of the late 20th century. We've also seen pictures of French boats getting very close to UK trawlers in the past, and we are very much an island nation where Britannia rules the waves. And we have seen it used significantly in the Leave campaign. So there is a great deal of feeling out there in the UK towards the fishing industry. And the UK is determined to become an independent coastal state, controlling its own fish stocks. It wants to negotiate terms here where the UK only negotiates contracts with the EU on a one-year basis, quotas on a one-year basis. The EU, on the other hand, wants full access to UK fishing waters in return for the UK having access to EU fishing waters as they are at the moment. It also wants to be able to negotiate quotas on a 5-year ahead basis. So again, differences, but potentially negotiating points which could be used elsewhere. Perhaps a minor point, but also important across the whole of the negotiations, is police and security. The UK wants to continue to have access to EU databases and would also quite happily supply UK information into those databases as well. The EU, on the other hand, sees access as not being on offer, as the UK is no longer part of the EU. Now, obviously, from both sides' perspective, the area of police and security is important, and there is potential negotiation here to make both sides happy. But now let's move forward and have a look at the whole process of negotiation and how it is due to pan out over the next 6 months and what has already occurred in the first 4 months of negotiations. So in looking at the negotiating period, the 10 months of negotiations that we have, we can follow this rather nice diagram from left to right to look at the negotiations and see what's been discussed and see how far we've got along. Now obviously the whole thing started on 31st January with the UK withdrawal agreement, and the UK agreeing to that with the EU. That withdrawal agreement was accompanied by the political declaration. That political declaration is a high-level understanding of what those future negotiations are going to be and what they're going to consist of. It also included various dates for specific negotiations around things like fisheries, data adequacy, and financial services. Now, with the conclusion of the withdrawal agreement on the 31st of January, you would have thought negotiations would have started straight away. Well, they didn't, but they had to put in place dates, etc. to start. So the first meeting was on the 2nd of March. Very little progress was made, and the expectation was there would be a second meeting on the 18th of March, week commencing the 18th of March. Well, obviously we know what happened in the middle of March, with lockdown coming in mostly across Europe, and actually they did not meet again until the 30th of March, but by way of video conferencing. And there were 4 meetings in total by way of video conferencing during that March, April, May, June period, and the last one in the week commencing 2nd of June, all of them really producing very little progress indeed. So we find ourselves now in the middle of June, discussions, some movement to a certain degree, but at this point in time we're looking at the fact that negotiations are going to have to continue. Now there is a high-level EU-UK conference at the end of June where Boris Johnson will get an opportunity to discuss directly with the EU President of the European Commission, with the President of the European Parliament and with the President of the European Council progress, and to perhaps give a little push to those negotiations. The realisation very much is now that the negotiations are going to have to go on into July and beyond, and Michel Barnier has already said that he expects those negotiations to almost go right to the wire. But obviously we have important decisions to be made throughout this transitional period. As you all know, there is a date of the 30th of June 2020 when the UK has to decide by whether it wants to request an extension. Now that extension would allow the transitional period to be extended by 12 or 24 months, but the decision has to be made about the period of the extension, the length of it at that point in time. Now, the UK in terms of the withdrawal agreement, its Act of Parliament of the withdrawal agreement has already put into legislation that Boris Johnson or the Conservative government cannot request Parliament to extend the transitional period. So we're in a bit of a catch-22 where no progress has been made, but we are coming up to the deadline of extending that negotiating period. Obviously, the coronavirus and the fact that we've had lockdown, which has made negotiations difficult, does allow an excuse for Boris to set aside that legislation and to request Parliament and his own party to support him in setting aside that law and allowing the extension to happen. But there appears to be complete intransigence in that position with regard to the Conservative Party. The suggestion has been from Michel Barnier that negotiations will start again in July after the EU Council meeting at the end of June. But those negotiations may well consist of what is known as secret tunnel meetings. And what they mean by that effectively is that you put the two negotiating teams in a room, lock the door until they come to a compromise agreement. Effectively, they were used for the withdrawal agreement previously back in October last year, when the two sides were locked in on two occasions when they were negotiating the Northern Irish border. And obviously we did get some form of agreement there in the end. And it is a means of negotiation that's used when deadlines are pressing. In terms of where we are, well, we all think the 31st December is the important date. In actual fact, the important date is the 15th and 16th of October. That is when there is another European Council meeting. That is when the European Union, the member states, are expecting to have presented to them what the UK-EU free trade deal will be and what all of the parts of that will consist of, so they can agree upon it and it become law in the EU. Middle of October is that date, not the end of December. So the expectation is negotiations will probably go right up to the wire of that. After that 15th, 16th October, then little nitty-gritty bits of the agreement can be sorted out, and actually there is an expectation that negotiations may well continue after that date to deal with any small outstanding issues, in fact into the 2021 calendar year. We are in the transitional period. We are not a full EU member, but we do effectively benefit from what the EU consists of, and we are contributing to a certain degree towards EU coffers during this period. But that transition period has its own set of rules with regard to what rights UK nationals have living in the EU or moving to the EU during this period. And they were all laid down in the withdrawal agreement, and that is a separate set of rules that is in place now. But effectively those rules remain in place for anybody, any UK national that arrives in the EU and becomes a legal resident before 31st December. So we need to look at those rules and see what they might be, because obviously they're important if they're going to remain with you for life or for the time that you are living in a particular EU member state. So if you are someone who has already moved to the EU, an EU state, or if you're someone who feels they may be able to move and become a legal resident in an EU state before 31st December, effectively these are the benefits of doing that, perhaps compared to moving to the EU after 31st December. And we will look at what that situation might be in the slide after this one. So let's go through these different aspects of becoming an EU legal resident before 31st December. For those people that arrive in the EU, they are covered by something called the EHIT card in terms of healthcare for the first 3 months. And an EHIT card stands for European Health Insurance Card and will cover you for your basic healthcare during those 3 months. You will also, if you're of state pension age, be entitled to something called an S1 form. An S1 form is something that exists in the EU as a means of providing healthcare across border to those people of state pension age. So you would apply for this from the Department of Work and Pensions, take this with you to when you move, and on production of this in another country, you will be entitled to subsidised healthcare in that country under that state system. you may well have to contribute towards that healthcare financially, because in most other European countries, the state system only covers you for 70 to 80% of doctor's appointments, that sort of thing, but will cover 100% of major operations and long-term stays in hospital. But you will have to take out some form of other insurance to cover you for that other 30 or 20% cover, but that is common and in line with what nationals of other EU states have to do. That subsidised healthcare is effectively paid by the NHS in the UK. They cover the cost of that for you because you have contributed to the UK social security system over your working life. One other thing that you would be entitled to retain and keep, either for your life or for the time that you live in that EU state, whichever is the shorter, is the lifetime export of what they call the uprated UK state pension. Uprated effectively means, in the old style, inflation linking your state pension to whatever is the annual increase that occurs and to whatever the increase is that normal UK nationals get that reside in the UK. So you would continue to be entitled to that. Another matter is something called social security coordination, and actually the S1 form is all part of social security coordination, but what we're talking about here is that in normal situation, if you're somebody who goes and works abroad, then it takes you 10 years living in another country effectively to become entitled to some form of state pension from that country. This social security coordination means that you only have to do 10 years across Europe to get some element of contribution, some element of state pension from that country, apportioned to the period that you actually live there. In terms of applying for legal residency in that country, you are due to do that after you've been resident for 3 months. But obviously at this current time, during the transitional period, part of the withdrawal agreement is that freedom of movement still exists. So effectively you don't have to rush to go out there and sort out your residency permit. You are able to apply in country, in the country you've moved to, locally, and what I call at your leisure. What this means is you are not rushed to do that within a certain time frame. The time frame is effectively a final deadline for the application to be with those authorities by 1st of July 2021 next year, 6 months after the end of the transitional period. For the economically inactive, and this really means those people who are either retiring early and moving to the EU, or are of state pension age and not working and are not entitled to an S1 for some reason, then to obtain a residency permit, it is necessary for you to satisfy two main factors, 2 main points. Those points are that you have to have a certain level of income so that you are not a burden on the social system, social care system, social security system of the country you have moved to. And that also you have whatever medical cover is required for you to, again, not be a burden on that country's healthcare system. So we've already talked about the S1, that will get you that healthcare if you are of state pension age. But for those that retire before that, there are other ways of accessing the healthcare system. But in terms of what is the income requirement, well, across Europe, these regulations have never been really enforced particularly heavily, but now most UK nationals that are living in the EU are having to go out and get residency permits. They are having to satisfy these particular regulations. And those regulations basically say that if you are someone who has retired early, so you've retired before state pension age, then your income level has to be the same as or above what is the local unemployment benefit in that particular country. If you are of pension age, state pension age, then your income level has to be whatever the state pension is in that particular country. So you can probably realise by those kind of figures that those qualification numbers aren't particularly high. So there are substantial benefits here for you arriving before 31st December, particularly as those benefits stay with you for as long as you reside in that country. And if you reside in that country for the rest of your days, then they will remain with you for as long as that is. Perhaps now we should look at what the position might be if somebody is moving after 31st December. Now, obviously, we don't know what those rules are going to be because negotiations are still ongoing and negotiations haven't actually produced anything to give us a pointer of what the situation might be in terms of citizens' rights post 31st December. Now, all we can do is base our opinions upon pre-existing agreements where civilised third state countries, as the UK will become, what civilised third state countries have already negotiated with the EU or have already negotiated with EU states individually on a bilateral basis. So let's look at those, and this is probably what the scenario is going to be should the UK leave the EU, the transitional period, should withdraw and leave the EU effectively without an agreement. So this is the worst case no deal scenario. The EHIC potentially will fall away. The EHIC card, which allows you to get medical cover from the NHS in the UK, so your cover comes from them, is paid by them and covers you locally in the country that you've moved to for those first 3 months, that will fall away. So any insurance that you take out for those first 3 months will need to include some form of medical cover for you to be allowed to enter the country. The S1, which we discussed, allows pensioners to access the local healthcare, again paid for by the NHS on an ongoing basis for as long as you live there. The S1 will also fall away, so again pensioners may need to take out some form of private health insurance. Now, one thing I would say is that private health insurance in Europe is actually somewhat cheaper than it is in the UK, so the price may not be perhaps as prohibitive as it may be seen as being here. And it's worthwhile investigating in each country. Your UK state pension won't be inflation linked, won't be triple locked as it would be if you moved pre-31st December under the withdrawal agreement. That frozen state pension obviously means that as inflation rises year on year, the benefit of the state pension is always falling. We talked about social security coordination previously, and this means obviously that contributions that you make by way of social security if you're living in another EU state always in some way go towards earning you some form of state pension, as long as across all those EU states you do 10 years worth of work, then there is some form of contribution to a state pension. On this basis, with no social security coordination, that would mean that if you work, say for instance, for 9 years in Germany, making contributions to their system, then potentially those 9 years would not give you any contribution towards a state pension at the end of it all. Now, also previously we talked about how you would obtain a residency permit, and you're able under the withdrawal agreement to move to a country and apply as I described it at your leisure. Well, now if you arrive after 31st December in a worst case scenario, you're going to have to apply for a visa in advance. That's how it works for third states. What I mean by apply in advance is you have to apply at, say, if you're moving to France, you have to apply at the French embassy in the UK. You have to put an application in. It may well involve you attending a meeting to go through the form and to answer a number of questions. It also is likely to be necessary for you to translate some of those documents into French. This potentially could be an obstacle for some people in that you're not going to be able to move and then sort this kind of stuff out afterwards. You're going to have to sort it out before you go. So it is something you're going to have to deal with before you leave the UK. We talked about the economically inactive, those that retire early, or those people of state pension age, and the fact that they are required to satisfy a minimum income requirement and also have some form of health insurance, be it private or public, so that through both of those means they are not a burden on the social system, the social care system in the particular country they're moving to. Now, previously we said that those income requirement was in the region of the unemployment benefit for those people that have retired early and the state pension for those people of state pension age. Once you are a third state, and in this situation, no deal scenario moving after 31st December, it is not those numbers that we're looking for. In most agreements that the EU has or EU countries have with third state countries, those outside the EU for their arrivals, you are looking at a level of the national minimum wage. In almost all instances, the national minimum wage is higher, and in some cases much higher, than either the unemployment benefit or the state pension. The national minimum wage in somewhere like France is around €18,250 a year, and in Spain I've certainly heard of numbers of €22,000. So the numbers differ obviously country by country, but there will always be local interpretation of those rules, so it may well not be a hard and fast number to look at. So these are, to a certain degree, considerably different rules than if you arrive before 31st December. And it's worthwhile you understanding what they are. But what I would also say is that each country has slightly different rules. So in terms of accessing the local government subsidised healthcare system, you may well be able to do that in somewhere like Spain by making a small payment per month. That payment may well be less than what it would cost you to take out a private insurance policy. Also, as I said previously, private medical insurance is not as expensive in Europe as it is in the UK. You may well also look at somewhere like France, where you can access the system, the subsidised healthcare system, by making a contribution, a social charge contribution, based upon the investment income that you have on an annual basis. That level is in the region of €20,000 a year per person, and that's quite a lot of investment income to have, and you pay 6.5% on any investment income over that minimum level. So the actual social charge you may end up paying in that particular case could actually be quite low or non-existent whatsoever for you to get into the government subsidised healthcare system. So you can see by investigating each country and looking at it in some detail that actually the situation may not be as bad as it looks on paper or on these slides here. So please come and discuss this with us, and we can obviously advise you of what the local scenario is for the country that you're looking at. Well, I hope this has been useful, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.
At Blevins Franks, we have over 20 offices across Europe dedicated to helping you make the move from the UK to your country of choice. So if you are considering making a move to Spain, France, Portugal, Cyprus or Malta, and you would like to know more about what that could mean for you, please do get in touch by sending an email to inquiries@blevinsfranks.com and stating exactly where you would like to move to. Alternatively, you could visit us online at www.blevinsfranks.com or calling us on +44 207 389 8133. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch this video. We look forward to speaking with you soon.